Hello everyone, I'm Alex Palanak and I'm Head of Sanctuary Seekers Unit at the University of Leicester, and I'd like to welcome you to our 5th annual Researching Refugeedom session as part of our University of Leicester Breaking Barriers Refugee Week 2025. This session aims to showcase the work of researchers exploring aspects of forced migration through the lens of different disciplines. So first of all, I'd like to just run through a couple of housekeeping bits. So please could you use the question and answer function to submit any questions and comments. So you can use this at any point during the session, but the presenters will be addressing your questions in a section at the end of the presentations. And we will be recording this session for future use, and then we will be sharing the link to the video with everybody who signed up to the event and on various mailing lists afterwards. And if you do have any queries following this session, then please email sanctuary@le.ac.uk. Okay, so I'm really pleased to be joined by 3 researchers for this session today. So first of all, we have Dr. Mohammed Ateek, who is a lecturer in applied linguistics at the University of Leicester. And we also have Carla Field, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Leicester School of Law. And then we have James Moran, who is a PhD candidate and senior lecturer in curriculum design at the University of Westminster. So I'm going to now move on to introduce Mohammed. So Dr. Mohammed Ateek is a lecturer in applied linguistics at the University of Leicester in the UK. His main areas of interest are language and migration, language and theories and practice of TESOL. He also researches the role of language in refugee migrant education and how it facilitates social cohesion in hostile environments. He worked as a consultant for the UK Home Office Refugee Employability Programme and the British Council Language for Resilience project. Prior to joining Leicester, Mohammed worked at Birkbeck, University of London and the University of Reading. So it's my great pleasure to hand over now to Mohammed.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone who's attending and watching this event. So I'll be talking about family language policy in a refugee setting, with less focus on the literature review and more focus on the context of the study, which took place in Turkey, and more focus on the data. Next slide, please. Now, family language policy is the explicit and implicit planning in relation to language use within the familial context, and bridging the gaps between studies of child language acquisition and the field of language policy research. The study of family language policy seeks to understand why and how members of some transnational families maintain their language while members of other families lose theirs, in what ways some children growing up in a largely monolingual society become bilingual, while other children growing up in a bilingual environment become monolingual. What language planning and decisions caregivers make to support or discourage the use and practice of particular languages, and how these decisions and practices interact with broader language ideologies and educational policies. In this regard, family language policy is shaped by mainly 2 forces, internal forces and external forces. And of course, internal forces, these are the forces that are related to the forces inside the family itself, why families and these are related to ideologies, to language practices and language management. But then we have the external forces, such as the political forces, the societal forces, the economic forces that sometimes dictate on how families should use their languages in the public sphere. And the development of family language policy as a field of inquiry has undergone different phases, from viewing language acquisition as an uncontested state of private affairs in the early period to a broader view of language development as ideologically shaped social practices in recent years. This evolving development has advanced our understanding of family language policy as a complex web nested in a wide range of socio-historical, political, cultural, and linguistic environments. Also, the study of family language policy, the main focus in the early years of family language policy as a field of inquiry was on European white middle-class families. For example, a Dutch family living in the UK, a white English family living in France, and how they deal with languages, how they deal with the language they speak and they use and the language of their children. More recently, more transnational families have been included in the family language policy research, such as Korean families in the US, or probably Iraqi families in the UK. Next slide, please. Now, King argues that the current phase needs to include more transnational families and more minority languages. And this is the most recent phase, and it is called the fourth phase of family language policy research, where the need is actually to include more transnational families and also more focus on the global South, because most of family language policy studies have been conducted in the global North. And extremely little research has been conducted on refugee family language policy. So again, the main focus was on white European families, then more transnational families, but less focus on the global South, and also way less focus on refugee family language policy. Next slide, please. Now, but how different it is between migrant transnational families and refugee families. It is the forced displacement aspect that is different, and with forced displacement aspect and experience, there is traumatic experience, there is PTSD, and there are elements that impacts not only on people's well-being, but also on how they perceive the concept of home and everything related to their home. So that means also their languages. Do they really want to detach themselves from the concept of home and what is related to home, including languages, or they want more connection with that? So and that also links to identity and the construction of identity. And also another aspect, which is really very, not very different nowadays probably, which is vulnerability as a label. And most of newspapers and the media, and including also the new media, label refugees either as an army of refugees coming to invade countries such as the UK and Europe, or it is given from more humanitarian perspective that refugees are vulnerable and need help. And in both cases, the concept of agency is minimized. And that also is linked to our talk today. And next slide, please. Now, to explain that concept more about the experience of refugees, this is an excerpt taken from a film which is called Sitting in Limbo. You arrive a stranger in a strange land, on the shores of the relatively peaceful, the relatively rich, the relatively secure. You arrive wrapped in questions that must be answered. Who are you? How did you get here? What have you done? Where are you from? To answer these and offer proof, you have only your body and your voice. Certainly, you will speak over and over to officials in a language or languages they don't understand. It is the language of your ancestors, or one of three used by your parents. Perhaps a language that you learned along the long road, or one you have nearly forgotten after all these years. Embrace it as the symbol of your origins. It may be the key to proving your story. And that is also linked to another field, which is language analysis for determination of origin, but we're not talking about this today. But this also shows the dilemma in terms of language use that refugees and asylum seekers go through. Next slide, please. Now, talking about the numbers of refugees, this is the numbers are slightly old now. I checked the numbers today, and the last figures by the UN HCR is actually more than 120 million refugees around the world. And the numbers of Syrian refugees still stand as they are, with some families and some Syrians are starting to go back to their country, but the numbers are, of course, still very minimal because of the uncertainty of what's happening in Syria, and also because family and people who have been in the host communities for many years, it's very difficult for them just to go back in a couple of months. And the IDPs, internally displaced persons inside Syria, around 7 million people, Syrian refugees, around 6.5 million, around 3.5 million Syrian refugees are actually in Turkey. So next slide, please. Turkey hosts the largest number of Syrian refugees. And of course, as you might be aware that in the recent years, there have been some unstable political and economic developments in Turkey that resulted in the devaluation of Turkish lira and the security threats, and also with the latest earthquake that happened in 2023 in Turkey and in Syria. All of these have been kind of fat materials for the opposition, but also for the media narrative to construct Syrians as a threat, not only to the economy of Turkey, but also to the security of the country. And Syrian refugees were perceived as a further threat by certain Turkish parties. Next slide, please. And this, in a way, has been translated into reality. These threats are not only threats, but they have been there have been some attacks on Syrian people and also on the language. As you can see, there is also one report here by the Human Rights Watch and other organizations about these attacks. Next slide, please. The attacks also included attacks on any shop or shops that include posters that are written in Arabic. And there are few governances in Turkey that actually prohibited the use of Arabic on in public on the blackboard to show the name of the shop or what they use, and that I'm sure of, at least in Mersin, which is one of the cities that included some families for our research. Next, please. Now, in terms of languages and the state of languages in Turkey, there is one article, and I think it's Article 42 of the new constitution in Turkey, that talks specifically about languages, and no language other than Turkish shall be taught as a mother tongue to Turkish citizens at any institution of education. Foreign languages to be taught in institutions of education, and the rules to be followed by schools conducting education in a foreign language shall be determined by law. And this is from the Constitution. But that also is at the expense of other minority languages in Turkey, including Arabic, because there are members, especially those in the borders with Turkey, in the borders with Syria. Turkish communities speak actually Arabic language, but they do not have the right to practice that language as a medium of instruction in schools. And there are more than 40 minority languages in Turkey. Now, so that resulted in some linguistic oppression, but also in some recent years, especially after the 2000s, there have been some freedoms of especially of the use of Kurdish. For example, there is Turk TV Kurdish. And Kurdish people started to use their languages in some private schools. Next, please. Now, this is the context of Turkey. And since it is the largest host of Syrian refugees, so we thought that it would be interesting to understand how Syrian families deal with their languages, and how does forced migration impact on family language policy of Syrian refugee families in Turkey in terms of identity construction, but also to understand how these members of family perceive their family language policy in terms of practices, ideologies, and management. Next slide, please. Now, to collect data, we recruited 10 families, only one parent family, and all the other families are two-parent families in 4 Turkish cities, and these are Mersin, Sakarya, Gaziantep, and Istanbul. Of these families, there are 10 mothers, 9 fathers, and 13 children between 6 and 10 years old. All children except 3 were born in Turkey. And only Arab families were included in this study. And this is, of course, a limitation of our study, because there are other families that use Kurdish and other languages in Syria. In terms of the methods, we interviewed the parents. And also for the children, we used something which is called language portraits. And language portraits consist of the outline of a bodied cellulite, which participants must color by choosing the colors to represent different languages, placing them on different body parts, resulting in a graphic visualization of their linguistic repertoire. Next slide, please. And of course, we used thematic analysis in our study. Now, after collecting data from the interviews and language portraits, we came up with main themes. And the main theme is that religion as a principal pillar for family language policy. In their interviews, parents emphasized the religious aspect of maintaining Arabic. For them, Arabic is not only the language of the Quran, but also the method of safeguarding their religion. Arabic is also a nation's mark and the representation of an Arab's linguistic identity. Arab identity in most of the 20th century was based on the unity of language above everything else. And all parents in this study referred to religious rituals as a main anchor for encouraging the use of Arabic at home. That is to read the Quran, to pray, and to engage in Islamic rituals. The excerpts highlight the parents' responsibilities and positions as careholders, Muslims and Arabs in the context of refugee communities that speak multiple languages. These numerous aspects of parents' identities are interconnected and have an impact on how children are raised in terms of language and culture. Next slide, please. The second theme is commitment to heritage language maintenance, and that is mainly related to management, how people manage their languages in terms of practice and in terms of use. For example, we speak Arabic with them, of course, with the children, most of the time and almost everywhere. We reply on Turkish only when it is related to their school lessons and to their homework. So it's only on the education sphere. And the data suggests that parents have varied attitudes towards heritage language maintenance. Some are highly supportive, while others are indifferent. Families find themselves in a process of negotiation where the actual presence becomes under direct reshuffling to become a part of the new society. Either they adopt this position to integrate or mark themselves to avoid full assimilation. Most parents showed strong commitment to heritage language maintenance, which is Arabic, as you can see in these excerpts, with some management practices. However, next slide, please. The parents who showed indifference on their part to maintain heritage language at home, claiming that at this time of their lives, studying the dominant language of schooling is more important, and any summer Arabic schools will negatively affect their Turkish. And this is, of course, related to language ideologies that learning one language will negatively impact on learning another language, which research shows that it is not true. Next slide, please. Now, hiding Syrian linguistic identity. These are really some interesting excerpts from the interviews that shows how parents and children avoid using heritage language in public, trying to avoid markedness. Baxter referred to this element of awareness as agency, where the individual is fully aware of the differences between their heritage language and the counter language of the receiving society. Switching between languages depends on the discursive context and what it entails. Individuals are not uniquely positioned, but are produced as a nexus of subjectivities in relations of power that are constantly shifting, rendering them at times powerful and at other times powerless. The quotes highlight how some Syrian families in Turkey avoid using Arabic as they feel it marks their Syrian identity in public in Turkey. Next slide, please. Now, this is Hala, and this is an example of language portraits. And this is also the fourth theme, which is related to language portraits. And the children in the portraits make a clear connection between language skills in a language and its placement and the amount of color in the language portraits. Now, what you see here is that anything in green that represents Arabic, anything in red that represents Turkish. And as you can see, Hala, she is the one who drew this, and she's a 9-year-old child. And Hala over here justifies the choice of red for herself. As you can see, it's only really very little on her feet in green, representing Arabic, and the rest is in red, which represents Turkish. Because I have been learning, Hala says, because I have been learning Turkish for a long time, I feel I am a Turk. I colored my little brother with little red because he can speak very little Turkish or Arabic. I placed extra red color on my mother because she and my older sister can use Turkish to some extent. As for my father, there is little red because he can speak little Turkish. All the color choices the children gave are personal, subjective and emotional. Yet they reflect, when observed together, how the children see themselves and their parents' proficiency in Turkish and Arabic. Next slide, please. Now, when we asked, because there is a research assistant who collected the data from Hala, and when he asked her, more about her choice of why she used red. And then she said, because I am a Turk. So this is the conversation between the researcher and Hala here. Because I am a Turk. And then he says, yes, do you feel part of you is Syrian? And then she says, just at home. When my mom comes to school to pick me up some children laugh at me and then they say, look at these refugees. So I am a Turk. So it's basically causing her some sort of stress and maybe trauma to say that she is Syrian or that she speaks Arabic. And that is because of the bullying that she undergoes at her school. And when I was listening to this conversation, the first thing that came to my mind is that how really ethical it is for the researcher, and for us as a researchers, like, to ask these questions that might really provoke some sort of traumatic experiences and trigger some kind of trauma. And I just didn't feel that it was the right way. I felt that it's just like, I'm sharing my thoughts out loud over here about the ethics of these, because especially when we deal with vulnerable groups, I think we all get, of course, the ethics approvals from our institutions, and then it stops there. But then there aren't really measures of checking how this is going, unless if you do some self-reflection. And this is just sharing my thoughts that maybe there should be another way of, probably, that as researchers, we shouldn't probably start researching vulnerable groups unless we do some kind of training on these and how to deal, because the researcher left it there. Like, is it true to leave it there, or is it true that they should say something or that they shouldn't say something? I really don't know the answer, but I think some experts on this can answer these questions, and therefore some sort of training to, when we research vulnerable groups, is necessary. Next slide, please. Though families in this study displayed a strong commitment to heritage language maintenance, they reported their embarrassment and sometimes fear of speaking Arabic in public spaces. This is linked to the discussion on the external forces, including social and political environments that impact family language policy and how people view and practice languages. The contradiction between being proud to be Syrian and don't want to be Syrian let families suffer from a paradox. The current level of indecisiveness shows how the general public has a strong effect and heavy magnitude on minorities, and consequently on how refugees feel about themselves and their languages. Societal discourses draw the boundaries for any newcomer, which could impact on the migrants' well-being. Forced migration causes mental stress on families, which might affect how they manage their language practices and consequent well-being. The latter, multifaceted, has been shown to benefit individuals by predicting greater adaptation to stress. Refugees and asylum seekers are vulnerable groups, and home languages are one of their greatest assets. Taking away these assets just adds to their vulnerability and consequently affects their well-being negatively. Language portraits revealed children's attitudes, ideologies, and feelings about languages, and also about the wider context of settings in which languages they are used in. Next slide, please. It is really about the wider context, and the effect is bidirectional between socio-political, economic context and languages. As shown in the examples and the data, families are not self-contained and separated from other social institutions, but are shaped by history and power. And this viewpoint is essential to theorizing the role of families in maintaining marginalized languages and identity construction, and the role of hierarchies, whether social or political, in further marginalizing the already marginalized. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. It was really fascinating to hear you speak about that link between the choice of language and the construction of one's identity as a Syrian refugee in Turkey, and how this has kind of been seen to throw up various ethical issues and a range of different emotions in the participants. And I'm sure there'll be some questions about that research at the end of this session. So yeah, thanks very much once again. So next, we're going to move on to hear from Carla Field, who is a current PhD student at the University of Leicester School of Law. Her research focuses on the issue of environmental-based cross-border displacement and the legal implication of protection available to those seeking sanctuary from climate harms. Carla is a University of Leicester graduate, obtaining her LLM in 2020, and has experience working with individuals with lived experience of displacement through her work with the British Red Cross. So I'm going to hand over now to Carla.
Thank you so much for that. That was a really nice introduction, and I've got a tough act to follow because Mohammed's talk there was brilliant. But yeah, thank you so much to everyone from the Sanctuary Unit for inviting me to be part of this really amazing panel discussion today, and to be able to kind of share some insights on what I think is a really important issue. I want to try and make what I'm talking about today, just given the wide-reaching audience of this discussion today, as accessible as possible. So I'm going to try and explain everything sort of in as accessible terms as I can. But the title of my talk is this excuse me, this idea of navigating this climate refugee nomenclature. And what do I mean by that? So the purpose of this talk then is really to understand what is this idea of the climate refugee. What is the climate refugee terminology? What does it mean? Where has it come from? And why do we see it used so often, not only in academia, but also just in popular media as well? And why do we as consumers of media come across it so often? And why is that in itself so important? To understand very briefly the kind of legal implications around the use of this terminology, the climate refugee or environmental refugee terminology, and I will use those terms kind of interchangeably today, although they are nuanced. And then after that discussion, to actually consider if there is a space for this terminology to be beneficial, and whether or not the potential benefits of this terminology, is there a space for this now, or is this a space that we might need to build in the future? So these are the things that I'm hoping to kind of address here this afternoon. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. If we just click the button there, thank you. So just while you kind of watch what's happening on the screen. So at this point, you're probably asking yourself, I'm talking about the climate change terminology, and you might be thinking, what am I talking about? What do I mean by climate refugee, environmental refugee? And if it's not something that you've come across, here in front of you are just a few examples I've pulled from media that we maybe do come across very often. Things like The Independent, the BBC. I think I've hopefully put it in there, there's examples from things like Al Jazeera, all the way down to things like independent media like Norova Media as well. And also we get examples in pop media as well, things like TV shows. What is meant by the climate refugee? Well, when we see it being used in the media like this, it's being used to describe people, individuals or groups of people who are being forced to move, often across borders, but also within their own countries, because of some kind of environmental based harm. And it's being used to describe that displacement that they're experiencing. But the headlines that we've just seen there, the way that it's being used to describe these kinds of displacements would suggest to me as a reader of these headlines that these people are being afforded some kind of protection, because they're being described as climate refugees. And in fact, this last headline here that I've kind of left you with on the screen, this is telling me that explicitly. This BBC article is saying that people urgently fleeing climate crisis cannot be sent home, UN rules. And unfortunately, I have the job of telling you that this headline is actually really inaccurate. So this headline is in reference to a really important case, excuse me, a really important case that came out of the United Nations Human Rights Committee in 2020. And this case regarded an individual and his family who had been forced to leave New Zealand back to one of the Pacific Islands, a place called Kiribati. And this headline would suggest that the decision to remove this family out of New Zealand was inappropriate, and that therefore there is some kind of protection available to people who are facing extreme climate harm. But actually, that's not what the Human Rights Committee ruled at all. And in fact, this case did fail. This case did fail, and it was ruled that they didn't have any kind of refugee protection available to them. And there's a few reasons that we're going to explore as to why that is the case. If we could just go to the next slide. So I guess this then asks, where does this idea of the climate refugee then come from? If there is no protection actually available to individuals who are fleeing climate harm, why are we seeing it so often described in news articles, in TV shows and things like this, as well as in our own legal academic literature as well? Well, where this kind of terminology came from is a little bit spotty. Some people say that the use of the terminology came from specific individuals. Others say that it originally came from the use of agencies kind of around the 1970s. But what we can categorically say is the popularization of the terminology came from the 1985 UN Environment Programme paper, Environmental Refugees, which was produced by the academic SM El-Hinwawi. And this paper, while fantastic, did create some of these issues that we're discussing today. So what this paper aimed to address is the viewable, observable displacement of individuals because of environmental harms. So if we can kind of think back to 1985 when this paper was published, in the lead up to this, there are many kinds of significant environmental disasters that did see a lot of displacement, both internal and cross-border displacements. Just some examples that come to my mind are things such as the 3 Mile Island disaster in the United States, the Sahel drought across areas of North Africa in the 1970s, and things like the Bhopal disaster as well in India. in 1984. All of these things resulted in some form of displacement, whether these disasters were induced by early recognitions of climate change or were man-made. And what this paper aimed to address was the fact that these kinds of environmental harms can in themselves induce displacement. So what El-Hinwawi did was create this definition of an environmental refugee. And he defines an environmental refugee as any person who has been forced to leave their traditional habitat temporarily or permanently because of a marked environmental disruption, natural or triggered by people, that jeopardized their existence or seriously affected their quality of life. So again, thinking back to those examples, anything essentially that's causing significant harm to the individual, the habitat in which they're living, and therefore forces them to have to leave that traditional habitat. So what has happened here is we're viewing these instances of displacement, and Essa Malhinwawe has therefore defined these people who are being forced to leave their traditional habitats. But in doing so, he's adopted the refugee language to describe these forms of displacement. Now, what we're then left with, unfortunately, is what I will go on to describe as the definitional gap. Because although we are seeing displacement, the displacement that we're seeing does not actually fit what we would describe as a refugee. And if we could just move on to the next slide. And the reason for this is because we already, prior to this publication, have a prescribed for definition of a refugee. And for this, we need to turn to the 1951 United Nations Convention definition. So the United Nations defines a refugee as somebody who has been displaced specifically across a border. So it cannot include someone who is displaced within their own borders, because of a specific reason personal to them. So it has to be because of a reason such as race, religion, or nationality, some kind of protected characteristic. And it has to be because of persecution. So if we translate this back into the definition of environmental refugee that we've just seen, these two things don't quite fit together like a puzzle should. So what we see, as I've described already, is a definitional gap. Although we're seeing and we can kind of view these instances of displacement, and this displacement, as I say, could be internal or across borders because of marked environmental harm and significant environmental harm, it doesn't fit the existing refugee definition. And therefore, what we have is this definitional gap. If we could just move to the next slide. So, what's the problem with this? Why does it matter that these two definitions don't align with one another? Well, what it means is that although the language of refugee law has been employed to describe the kind of displacement that's being observed in environmental circumstances, by using and employing that language doesn't automatically therefore give those kinds of asylum rights onto those people who are displaced because of environmental harm. Because what we need to observe and what we need to see is someone fitting into the criteria of persecution because of a protected characteristic, which doesn't fit those environmental circumstances. And in using the refugee language, we can actually observe other issues as well. So some academics have recognised some of the other problems that arise by using and employing the refugee definition to describe the climate refugee problem. So one such issue is that using the refugee language outside of its legal scope may actually weaken existing refugee discourse. And this is particularly pertinent, I think, in the existing geopolitical situation that we are currently in, where we see already a lot of countries, particularly in the West, already attempting to erode the existing refugee protection that we do have that is prescribed for. So one academic, Callum Nicholson, has argued that using language figuratively to sketch a theme rather than engage in an analytical, literal, exact and unambiguous set of claims is an inaccurate way to use legal definitional language and is therefore going to create more problems than solve them. And this is something that's also been argued by David Durand de Cleyre, and he's also concerned about the fact that using refugee discourse to describe displacement issues does not in itself provide access to protection, as I've just described, and actually could in fact limit policy developments going further, which is what we need to happen. So David Durand de Cleyre has done a very interesting study in which he's surveyed policymakers and people working on the ground with refugees and asylum seekers in France. And these are the concerns of those people. They're concerns that by employing the climate refugee or environmental refugee terminology, we may actually limit policymakers from developing specific and targeted responses to the observable displacement as a result of environmental harm that is happening. Excuse me. And a final issue that we also see with this is that delineating a subcategory of climate refugee risks rejecting well-established discourse on the multi-causal factors for displacement. And what I mean by this is that often there's not one single reason that someone has decided and made that decision to leave their home country. The decision often has many factors, and delineating a subcategory of specifically a climate refugee narrows this down very specifically and may actually become very difficult to access. And what it also does by specifically being climate would also risks rejecting other forms of environmental harms if there were further policy developments. So this terminology has multifaceted issues that we ought to address. But is it all bad? And this is something that more recent academics have started to look at. If we could just move to the next slide. Thank you. So while there are many issues with the climate refugee terminology, most of these issues are, as I've already discussed, based on the fact that we have this definitional gap, the fact that the existing refugee definition doesn't align with our idea of an environmental refugee, particularly that given by the definition that I've explained from Essam Al-Henwawe in 1985. But something that we often forget is that the 1951 refugee definition is not the only definition of a refugee that exists in the world. And it's often a very Eurocentric idea to think that that's the only definition that exists. While it is the United Nations definition, it is the one that is used most across the globe, it is not the only one. For example, there are wider definitions of a refugee that exist, such as the Organisation of African Unity definition, or the definition that exists in the Cartagena Declaration, which covers parts of Southern and Latin America. Excuse me. Although there are limits to that because it's soft law. But it's important to remember that while there is that definitional gap might be to a lesser extent in other areas, and this has been addressed by some academics. And actually, this is something that has been talked about in a very recent paper by the academics Behrman and Kent, and they look at the definitional gap that exists, particularly through a post-colonial lens, and recognise the fact that refusing to address the fact that there is more than one refugee definition in existence denies the fact that this definitional gap may not actually exist in the way that we've already looked at, and also denies the fact that the history of the refugee definition itself actually has a very Eurocentric context. It's been historically its development has been very exclusionary, and actually, if we look at the context of climate change, which is obviously what we are discussing here when we're thinking about environmental-based displacement, climate change itself has a very important colonial context to it, particularly if we're thinking about it from an environmental justice perspective. So I suppose these are sort of fresh, as I've said, fresh perspectives under which we might be thinking about the use of this climate refugee terminology. So if we could just go to the last slide. Thank you. So that's been a very quick rundown of this terminology problem, and this is just one small aspect of the kind of environmental displacement, in inverted commas, problem. And it's just one area to which I'm looking at in my own PhD research at the moment. But I think the takeaway here that I'd like to kind of leave with people that are listening is the next time that you see one of these headlines on the BBC or wherever else is the next time you hear the words climate refugee, maybe stop and take a second and think about what it actually really means. So yeah, thank you very much. And thank you again to the Sanctuary Unit for having me.
Thank you so much, Carla. That's given us so much, and well, definitely given me so much food for thought, and I'm sure everyone else listening also. And this is such a kind of up and coming topic, and I'm sure that everybody has come across that term climate refugee before, but hasn't necessarily thought about it in those terms of, you know, how it might be detrimental to have this specific subcategory. Because I guess with the climate and the ecological emergency, there are going to be various different fallouts of that, and one of those might be vying for scarce resources, which kind of has economic implications, and another one is that there might be increased risk of conflict, which then might go more towards the traditional category of reasons for forced migration. And so, yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm sure there'll be questions about that at the end of this session as well, trying to kind of unpick the implications of that. Okay, so now we've had two of our presentations, and because it's a 2-hour-long session, we're going to have a 5-minute comfort break next. And so we'll be back in 5 minutes' time to hear our final presenter, which is James Moran, who's going to be talking about access to higher education for forced migrants. So yeah, we'll see you in a few minutes' time. Okay, hello again, everyone. So we're going to make a start now after our 5-minute break. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the next presentation and the next presenter, James Moran. So just to introduce him, before moving into academia, James worked first as an immigration advisor and then international student and welfare advisor, enabling him to work with a diverse range of clients and students from all around the world. Now, as a senior lecturer in curriculum design at the University of Westminster, James teaches on the PG Cert in higher education, supports embedding of strategic priorities around embedding EDI and education for sustainable development in curricula, and is responsible for the intensive course design process. His research interests include curriculum design, experiences of refugee background students in UK higher education, widening participation in higher education, international student experience of higher education, and well-being of teaching staff. So I'll hand now over to James.
Thank you very much. The one thing I clearly failed to add into that biography was actually my PhD studies also with the University of Lancaster. So apologies to Lancaster, I wasn't meaning to cut that out because actually that's where the research from today is based from. First, I'd like to say thank you very much to the first two presenters. Really interesting things in there. There's a couple of themes that I'll echo, hopefully within the work I'm talking about today, around issues of language and also sort of syntax and terminology. So different perspectives, but I thought it's quite interesting to hear those echoes. Next slide, please, if that's okay. Thank you. So today I'm just going to give a snapshot really of, I suppose, the early findings of some of my PhD work. So it's framed within discussions around access and participation to higher education in a UK context. And as I say, they are only the preliminary findings today, but looking at it in sort of a access and progression in higher education and trying to bring to life a little bit some of the voice of both refugee background students in UK higher education, but also those working to support them in different institutions. Next slide, please. So apologies, that's probably a little tricky to read. It's just to give you a snapshot of my background. So I think it's quite important to acknowledge that I have had experiences in education, predominantly through the British system. And I've also got a background in welfare and immigration advice, particularly supporting international student cohorts, which also did include supporting a number of refugee background students. I'd like to just make that clear because that does influence, obviously, how I interpret and engage with students, and also my background knowledge of the system that I'm sort of working and researching in. Next slide, please. So I thought it's worth just pausing briefly to give you an outline of where the UK currently sits in a couple of areas. So access and participation is a term you may have heard if you're familiar with UK higher education. It relates to sort of identifying and supporting different cohorts of students to, as it says, both gain access to university, also the progression through and what they go on to do afterwards. And the responsibility for this sits within a body known as the Office for Students. So this is an overarching body which has taken on increasing responsibilities in areas like quality assurance, as well as things like access and participation. So they are quite an all-encompassing body, and they've also introduced relatively recently something called the Equal Opportunities Risk Register, which if any of you have worked in access and participation teams, I'm sure you're now familiar with when putting together the access and participation plans, which are the plans that universities develop to identify and support these cohorts. And it has added a few more dimensions than has been seen previously in recruiting and supporting those students. So that's sort of the current climate in terms of the access and participation. There's an awful lot of literature out there on the development of that, and the focus on different characteristics and the influence of different policies and target groups. But that's a little bit beyond the scope we want to talk about today, but it's worth just sort of acknowledging that initial broader context. The other main context to focus on was actually where the immigration system. So the immigration system has been very, very tricky to negotiate for people sort of coming into the UK. So it has, if you remember back when Theresa May was Home Secretary, there was literally something in the hostile environment, and there were billboards being driven around with signs saying akin to something like "Please go home." And there was a long debate in the Brexit negotiations about introducing an Australian points-based system. Actually, we already had an Australian-style points-based system. In law, it was called the points-based system. So there's been a lot of confusion in debates, but it's safe to say that it was and has been challenging for both people coming in as forced migrants, as well as people coming in as international students and other categories. I also obviously we've had a new government, and so we have moved slightly away from the rhetoric on things like migrants being on the Viby Stockholm, the schemes to sort of relocate people claiming asylum to overseas. So it's still very early on in this government, but we may also be seeing a slight refocusing of the rights, and perhaps a slightly easier, so I think I said on the last slide, slightly less hostile, but I think that still does remain to be seen going forward. So it's worth just bearing in mind these two different settings of access and participation on one hand, but also this legacy of the hostile environment on the other, because that's what refugee background students who are entering UK higher education are negotiating. It's probably the best phrase. So refugee background students in the UK. So this is where that context of terminology comes in quite clearly. So refugee is a legal term in immigration. It is a status, and if you have been granted refugee status, then you qualify for home fees, so a slightly lower fees in the UK system, and you can access university student loans. There is also recognition within the access and participation system that they are an identified widening participation category, but there is no specific targets, and there's no real requirement to collect data in this area, though there have been a couple of nudges on the UCAS system for people to be able to identify in recent times. But although I'm using the term refugee background student to encompass quite a broad range of forced migrant background students and those from other categories, those who are identified as refugees within widening participation, it doesn't include asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are a separate category, and there's a stark contrast into the rights and access you have depending on whether you've been granted asylum and thus refugee status, or if you're still seeking asylum. So asylum seekers don't qualify for home fees. They have to pay the higher international fees, so they're considered as essentially international students if they attend university or other higher education institutions, and they also can't access the student loan system. There are also a plethora of other immigration categories, but they are usually either included as a home or international sort of categorization for fees. So I won't complicate that picture too much. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sort of backdrop, so I'm undertaking PhD at University of Westminster, looking at access to and progression through higher education in the UK for students from a refugee background. So I've completed the research, but I'm at the very comparably early stages of the analysis. But the research method I used when talking to refugee backgrounds was a narrative approach where I engaged with a method called the River of Life, which was an exercise in sort of capturing their story and their narrative in the form of a river. So it has a sort of linear element and capturing sort of the beginning, the middle and the end of that story, but it also enables sort of features to be added into that journey. So twists, turns, rocks, boulders, etc. And is I find it to be quite a nice, effective tool of enabling people to make sure they were the narrators in their own story. The participants I spoke to are a mixture of undergraduate, postgraduate, taught and PhD, mixture of nationalities, but predominantly from West Africa and Central Asia. There were a mix of participants, but they were majority male. And it's worth emphasising that I'm not seeking to explore their migration experiences coming to the UK. I'm looking at their journey sort of to and in higher education. But also, though I am talking about some of the issues that were identified and conclusions sort of people came up with in the research today, this is a qualitative piece of work, so it's not from a substantive population. Next slide, please. Similarly, I had a chat with some people at working at universities. So these were people involved in roles like with Sanctuary, some data planning roles, widening participation. And again, it's just worth noting that most of the participants I spoke to were from Sanctuary institutions. Therefore, obviously, they were coming from an informed perspective. Next slide, please. So it is the early stages. I emphasize that really because I'm not really framing today's talk as an academic piece as such. Really, this is some quite practical findings. So although the work I'm looking at is involved by the capabilities approach, and it will be, the things I'm sort of drawing out today really are some of the practical lived experiences and issues people are facing. So as I explained from my background, my academic identity is also informed by my sort of background in professional services. So I always find I sit in what Whitchurch identifies as that third space. So I'm slightly more sort of practical front than based sort of within the literature, but happy to sort of follow up on that because there is an enormous sort of literature base and further debates beyond this. Next slide, please. So when I began to look at the data, there were clearly a lot of different themes which emerged, and as mentioned, there are I suppose more complex themes which I will also go on to identify later, but there were some reoccurring issues which came out, and these are quite common also within the literature around barriers to access and in terms of issues that refugee background students might face. But it was quite interesting to put them in a sort of a contemporary context because obviously this research is quite recent. So the ones in bold highlighted there, so financial access to scholarships and financial support, English language support offered prior to and during study, recognition of prior learning, and university services is what I'm focusing on today. And I thought I should probably stop there because I found I was trying to condense several months worth of work into a 25-minute presentation. So I'm just going to focus on those. Next slide, please. So this is my shiny title slide, but we can probably move on from that quite quickly. So this was a quote from a successful applicant for a scholarship, and they said, "I don't have to think about my fees. Have to think about that would really have pulled me back. So I'd say the scholarship was the most important above everything." So I thought that really sort of captured you can't really underestimate the weight I found that the students put on the receipt of the scholarship. It was highly valued, especially with those students who didn't have a category of leave, which meant that they could actually apply for a student loan or an alternative form of funding. So particularly those, say, from an asylum category. Interestingly, it was also often the single determining factor. So it wasn't necessarily about the subject, it wasn't necessarily about the rank, it wasn't necessarily about the campus, it was whether they felt they were able to get and obtain one of the scholarships. So there's obviously some interesting things to explore there about sort of agency and choice. But yeah, the scholarship was often a determining factor of where they ended up attending. And you know, I don't think for those who were successful in receipt of the scholarship, it provided financial security, accommodation, significantly enhancing and gaining entry, and really enabled their journey throughout their time there. Next slide, please. But it's not without its challenges. So obviously not all scholarship schemes are the same. So there was one student who I spoke to who only had a partial scholarship. So I had a partial scholarship. I was really getting complicated and I had to get some other financial support. That was a real challenge for me. But it's also worth bringing in the institutional voice here. So it's also not that straightforward if you are working in a small team, if you're on your own. And I thought someone captured that quite well. They said, I think being in a big organisation, you're working on your own a little bit. And it's very difficult to actually get some traction for the scholarship. So it took many years to get it sorted. And there were a number of other sort of challenges faced by institutions in terms of actually introducing funding the scholarships as well. It's worth noting as well, they are a limited number. Like they are usually a handful of scholarships available to refugee background students at an institution, if there are any available at all. It can be challenging to introduce them. There's also, from the people I spoke to universities, there are quite a different range of criteria sometimes on what people are looking at in terms of how they're awarded. It's also, if the scholarship doesn't cover the whole fee, it may not be accessible to students from an asylum seeking background because they may not have the capacity to fill the gap. There was also one interesting, and these are questions which are raised, so I think it's quite important to emphasise that. So it's not an opinion. It was something that sort of emerged from the data, that when people were awarding scholarships, they were obviously looking at students who were felt best to study, students who would be able to meet these different criteria. But often it was also those students who had what you might call the highest levels of educational capital, those who already perhaps had degrees, had a fluency of English, that were perhaps therefore sort of meeting some of these criteria. And that's literally a question really, about maybe the criteria used, and it's which students are being able to benefit from that. Next slide, please. So this was just, again, some sort of questions which emerged in terms of thinking about reviewing that scholarship process. So there were some great examples. So one was, sorry, there's just a question coming in on the chat, but I'll pop back to that in a moment. There were some good practices which came out. So one which was really interesting to see was that actually there was a debate within one institution potentially about funding and scholarships for displaced students overseas. If you offer it at a distance, you're offering it in a, I suppose you call it a different market, then you can perhaps fund a significantly large number of scholarships for students overseas than you can perhaps in the UK. There were perhaps some grounds for looking at, say, reviewing those criteria to actually see which students are benefiting from it. I think the comment that popped up a second ago said something about charging home fees, and yeah, this is a really interesting idea. So I know there is a sort of complex set of processes for determining the legal element of whether you are home or international fees based on residency, etc. But there is also institutional discretion, and where institutions are able to classify asylum seeking students as home students, obviously they attract a lower fee than international. Therefore, if you have a limited resource pool for scholarships, you can therefore fund more students through it. Another thing which came out, so perhaps thinking about, again, extending that range of students who are able to benefit from the scholarships, was also thinking about providing scholarships for access and foundation courses to help facilitate that entry and therefore that ongoing progression through higher education. One idea which emerged, which I thought was a really interesting one, was an idea of a sector level scholarship. So in a way that choice is sometimes not a real choice for students. They can either afford to go or they can't afford to go, so they go where the scholarship is. But if there was a sector level scholarship where they apply for that, it's awarded, but they can still choose the institution, that does enable a greater choice to the individual. And there are a couple of questions which were raised, and they're challenging. I'm not really seeking to answer them here. It was just interesting to note that there are exceedingly complicated personal circumstances and stories which comes with each applicant, but there's also a very limited pool. So if we're viewing this through the sort of, I suppose you'd call it the distributive lens of sort of social justice, i.e. there's a resource which is being allocated, then you can ask, who is that being awarded to, and can you make it go further? Now, an actual answer to that might be systemic review about moving away from that distributive view of justice to perhaps enhancing capabilities of individuals more generally. But as it stands, there were some interesting examples where there were students who had perhaps actually completed an entire degree in a subject and then came to the UK and were successful in their application for funding, but then were funded for a full 3-year degree in the same subject. So again, their circumstances and stories are really important, and they clearly benefited from that. But there was also meant that pool of funding was then out for that student for 3 years. So there are perhaps some interesting questions just to explore there in relation to which students are able to access it. Again, a similar issue which came up was students who actually had refugee status, meaning they could gain funding, and were successful in applying for a scholarship, but they were also eligible for applying for a student loan. Now, in an ideal world, you'd obviously fund everybody, and as I say, I'm trying to be really careful here because I don't have a judgment on this. I just wanted to highlight some of the issues which were raised through discussions with both students and staff. Next slide, please. So language. So language is, as the earlier talk sort of highlighted, it's an inherent part of the society we live in, the studies that we do, and is a reoccurring theme in the literature around accessibility and progression. So I just would put some context here. So it was identified by both staff and refugee background students as key to enabling a successful transition and continuation in higher education study. It was also interesting to note that a lot of the challenges around language, particularly where it was a course that progressed, so into second year, third year, etc. A lot of those challenges did sort of melt away a little bit because they were as they progressed on the course. Now, it would have been interesting to perhaps speak to students who maybe hadn't successfully progressed and see if that was still an issue there. But there was definitely an identified challenge within that sort of first period of arrival at an institution. It was also quite interesting that it wasn't necessarily the level of the language of the applicant, but the language used by the institution, which I thought was quite interesting. So a lot of terminology. So there were quite a few quotes, sort of similar to asking the question of, what is a tutorial? I'm told I have a tutorial, but if we don't provide that context and that meaning, if you're sort of newly arriving at higher education generally, it's almost like another language. There was also a slight perception that the language skills were responsible, or seemed to be responsible, for perhaps slightly lower marks achieved by the students. And so again, there's questions we can think about that learning and teaching, and how we engage in assessment there as well. Next slide, please. So I've probably covered a few of these already, but I particularly like this quote. So I needed to change my English into some sort of British English. So again, it's not necessarily that students don't have a high level of language, and it might be communicating sort of internationally in English is sometimes easier than perhaps communicating in this sort of British, or particularly this institutional English. There's also perspectives from the students there. So English is a massive barrier because it's not just about conversation English, it's about academic English, which is very different type of English. So some of the findings there, some students felt it was a little bit too basic, but they needed the classes which they were able to attend were deemed to be a little bit basic, but also didn't quite pitch them at the right level for that sort of integration to the institution. There was a lot of so classes also didn't necessarily address terminology. So academic English, I think they felt it was good for supporting their subjects, but never necessarily navigation of the system, which was quite an interesting finding. And also, again, that notion of that transition from perhaps someone who doesn't bring with them that full, if they're not already sort of fluent in English on arrival, how are we supporting those students to then also be able to access and continue through higher education? That was, I haven't quite covered it in this presentation, but there was an interesting point raised by one of the applicants about the immigration system itself, that when you actually are granted refugee status, they felt that the system itself pushed people towards work rather than education. So they had to attend appointments, demonstrate what they were doing. And so a lot of people, when they have the right to work, start working, and that takes them off on that direction rather than necessarily being able to look at the educational options as well. Next slide, please. So this was just a few thoughts that sort of emerged from it as well, about being able to, so I called it enhancing language provision, but also reducing language barriers. As I say, I think they are two sides of the same coin, and I've probably covered a few of these already, but some of them are very simple. Students sort of wanted to know things about, shifting in complex terminology in their communications, like if you are going to introduce a whole bunch of stuff in Welcome Week, or those first couple of weeks of terms, or give people a little bit more space to engage with it, or provide explanations along with those, even something like a glossary. Actually, maybe even thinking a little bit more root and branch about the way we're teaching, and things like adopting trauma-informed approaches to teaching of English. And there's a lot of quite interesting things that could be developed there. I'm aware I'm probably going to be drifting over time shortly, so I'll jump on to the next slide. So university support services. Next slide. Thank you. Sorry, I wouldn't have put all of these headings in otherwise. So this was quite interesting in terms of both how students kind of understood them and also then felt able to access them, and also the way in that institutions were able to, I suppose, presented them to the student base themselves. So students generally sort of thought of them as these sort of distributed network of support, and they were able to identify things like counselling services, library, but there was also a bit of conflation in terms of, so if you've ever worked or attended a UK university, you'll know that they are often quite distributed. You might get support on an academic side for one thing. You might get it also perhaps at the library from careers services, so from the student union. So they are all this separate one. So students weren't always necessarily clear about where to get necessary support and who to speak to. Next slide, please. So these were some of the challenges which sort of emerged. And again, this is from quite a small interview base, but I still think it had some quite interesting challenges which it identified. So there was the awareness of the full range of services available. Some of them felt that it was quite focused on home students, with less bespoke support available to international students or refugee background students. Again, this notion of terminology came up. So, and I fell into this trap because I've worked in higher education a long time. So I would ask a question, did you talk to your personal tutor? And the response I often got was, oh, I couldn't afford that. That's because personal tutor and private tutor were not necessarily understood, they were distinct. So if we're presenting, the person that a student should be able to speak to as a first point of call, almost as a pastoral academic support, in a term that makes them think that it's perhaps a paid for service, you can see how that's going to cause some challenges. There's also, I think, both from the institutional and student side, a little bit of disconnect between services sometimes. So should a student get support from a academic personal tutor? Should they be accessing something which maybe is on referencing in the library, for example? And also where one student accesses a service, maybe they get referred on to another, but do we have those mechanisms to actually check they've done so? So the institutions that were able to do that often had a singular point of contact that students from a refugee background were able to engage with. But I think it was more common that if a student was referred on to, there wasn't necessarily a way of determining if they had actually then gone on to receive that support. Next slide, please. So again, these are some fairly obvious suggestions, perhaps, but it's about linking the services and referrals, reducing some of those barriers. Again, that overlapping of some of these criteria in terms of language. It was quite interesting that one student particularly referred to this sort of Western and Eurocentric approaches to a range of services. So I don't know if there is something that a training provision which institutions can adopt to sort of help facilitate an understanding. There was also, I think, this focus. So a couple of students had ended up enrolling late, therefore they had missed that induction period, and because they'd missed that induction period, that was it. They were sort of floundering to understand sort of where they should be when. And I think that's for any student. So this notion of sort of an ongoing induction and communication, and just keeping that reiteration of what is available to students across their journey. And one other thing was, so it was quite clear in a lot of cases where students had access to things like counselling, that the university services, perhaps understandably, were not able to necessarily deal with some of those complex issues and situations that emerged, and so they might have been referred out. But again, it was that, so once they've been referred out to the NHS, is there anyone in the institution still keeping that contact and relationship with them? Next slide, please. So this was my exciting animated slide. So this was, I called it recognition of prior learning. So this is quite an interesting one because, so I mentioned these sort of broad notions of educational capital at the beginning. And I'm not really viewing this research through that lens, but it was quite interesting that there were some students who were able to use that in a way to show that they, to access the scholarships by meeting sort of the criteria within that process. And there were other students who came with an enormous wealth of experience, but it wasn't recognised at all, and they were, they almost had to start right at the beginning. So there's one particular student who had several years of professional experience, had been a translator, had a qualification akin to a degree in their own country, but there was no way that they felt they could get it recognised, and so they started actually back on an access course. So 2 years prior to university, they had also identified some really interesting issues, actually again about the systemic process in immigration, about the role of language there. So they had been forced to have a translator in the process of seeking asylum in the UK, but they had felt that their language was actually more stronger than the translators because they were actually from a neighbouring country, and every time the translator would translate it slightly wrong or say something different, he would interrupt in English saying, look, this is nonsense, but the system, he felt he wasn't able to challenge that, and that they had to follow that sort of established process. So again, if you're aware of the UK admissions process from students from overseas, often they have a qualification. It goes through the UK NARIC system, and it sort of is at least from when I was involved, it was sort of a yes no, either this meets criteria, it doesn't. But then also it means that if they haven't got those documentation with them, they weren't able to bring them, then it can be very hard to evidence qualification experience, so entry may not be granted. Next slide, please. So those are some thoughts that emerged. Again, it's a great use of contextual offers. So this is where you may have a published entry standard for students, but the use of a contextual offer enables some discretion in that process, which can be used to support entry. Where possible, validating previous university courses more actively through examination of the course content and syllabus. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that actually, if we speak to people, if we talk to them about what they've studied, if we look and make an effort to have a look at what is on the course that they've studied elsewhere, even if it's said initially that it's only akin to a certain level, that it might be that in conjunction with some work experience that they are eligible to enter not right at the start of a programme. That may be an issue of choice, but are we at least facilitating students to be able to have that experience recognised? And again, just to re-emphasise that work experience particularly, so recognition of prior learning in the UK higher education system is usually based on qualifications studied elsewhere, and using that to have credits awarded equivalent to the studying already done. It's very rare for someone to be able to say, I've got, well, it's fairly rare to have this body of work. I've covered an enormous amount of the things that are on this course. Oh, that's good, but where's your certificate is often the sort of response. And if you haven't got that qualification, you still have to start at the beginning. And it's in some ways it's good for the course because you get this enormously experienced person being able to bring that perspective into the learning and teaching and engagement. But for the individual, if for them it might sort of facilitate their journey through education if they were able to make more use of that from the start on, and I say not necessarily start at the beginning. Next slide, I think we're maybe at the end. So these are obviously fairly initial thoughts, and as I say, they were just elicited ideas from the conversations with staff and students, and they've been focused today more on some of the sort of the practical elements rather than a full sort of breakdown of all of the concepts and themes underlining it. But these were some of the broad questions I thought that we could perhaps consider going forward as a sector. The can scholarship awarding process be reviewed to support those with less educational capital? So actually, can we look more broadly at the refugee background student population, and who are we able to extend further support to? A prior learning experience is sufficiently considered by the institution across the pedagogic and learning journey. Okay, they may not have a certificate saying that they are IELTS 6.0 or another qualification in English, but if you can have a conversation with them, they can submit a written piece. Can you still let them in, for example? And some institutions do this. Does English language provision consider the needs of students who may have a high level of language? But it's really just that context-specific support. So it's not that they can't necessarily communicate or engage. It's about, do they understand that this slightly closed world of higher academic language and terminology that we adopt? I think I might have made up a word here, but I wondered if we can determinologize institutions. So using more common sense everyday terms to describe HE specific circumstances. So some of the themes I mentioned at the beginning that I didn't actually sort of expand too much on, but there is a further need, I think, also to look at the utilisation of data. So this is sort of within the higher education access participation remit. An enormous amount of data is collected by institutions. They're mandated to collect it for certain populations of students and regarding access and participation. So if we have this data available to us, or if we don't have this data available to us, should we be collecting some of it? How can we use that to support students? Should we be using it to support students from a refugee background, not only on access, but throughout their journey? And I think I sort of lead a slightly more complex question at the end, but a student from a refugee background, like I suppose any student to some extent, has a hugely complex and intersecting identity. Yet as institutions, if they have refugee status, they are put in the home pot. If they're an asylum seeker, they get put in the international pot. And there's not really a lot of delineation. There's not really a lot of grey area or attempt to sort of try and identify and empathise with sort of the more complex circumstances. And that sometimes was one message that came out. So I wonder if that's something that we think about more broadly as a sector. OK. Oh, well, sorry, one more slide. Just to say that I'm pleased to say that a slightly earlier piece of work than this, but in a related field, I'm hoping will be has been accepted for publication. So this was actually an application of the work of Wilson Stridham's and her looking at the access and success in higher education, and I've applied that to looking at some of the circumstances within UK universities. So if you're interested, keep an eye out for that later on this year. OK, right, finished.
Well, thank you so much, James. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading that article when it gets published. And as someone who works in this space of widening participation for sanctuary students, I can see how valuable that piece of research is and all of the different recommendations that you've outlined. And yeah, I'm really kind of excited to see that being kind of disseminated across the sector and to see what sort of impact that might make, particularly things like the sector level scholarship is a really exciting idea. OK, so thank you so much to all three of our presenters. So now we're going to move on to the question and answer part of the session. I think we already have one question in the chat, and if anyone else would like to add any questions, then please kind of proceed to pop that in there. Actually, it's not in the chat, it's in the question and answer tab. You should see that, I believe, at the top of your like on the top menu bar. OK, brilliant. So we'll go on to our first question then. So this is a question for Mohammed. The question is, thank you for sharing your research and for the reflections on the ethical aspects of the study. I'm wondering if you collected any data on whether the parents or the children, if there are any older children in the family, intend to leave Turkey in the future and where they envision moving to, and whether this sheds any light on the paradox of proud to be Syrian versus don't want to be seen as Syrian. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank also Carla and James for the very interesting talks. And I think I have questions, but I'll leave this to later. I'll just answer the question. This is a very interesting question. When the data was collected, that was last year, nobody, no Syrian, including myself, thought that the day that Assad will be gone and that people will be thinking about returning. It was at a time where all the countries started to normalize relations with a dictator and a criminal. And we kind of lost hope, and it was not really to any of my thought that to ask them about, like, you know, when they're going back home, because the context back then, it was not about going back home, it was about how you're living here and the role of language. But to answer that question, I just, out of interest also, I just looked at the numbers of refugees returning to Syria, and this is from UNHCR website. More than, it says exactly, more than 1 million Syrians have returned home since the last developments in Syria. More than 1 million, including 290,000 Syrians from neighboring countries, including Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, and more than 800,000 internally displaced persons. So the internally displaced persons started more to move back to their homes. But also linked to that, I'm actually applying for a research grant now, which includes that question exactly, about returning and the role of, to what extent that language plays a role in the decision of families to return home. Because a lot of Syrian families started to have children outside Syria. And now, for example, in Europe, especially in Germany and Sweden, or in Turkey, or in these countries, their children, they might speak Arabic, they might use Arabic, but definitely not in education and not in school. And the language of their medium of instruction is the host community. And to go back to Syria, the medium of instruction is Arabic. And if families decide to go back, then that is really a huge issue, because their children do not have literacy. A lot of them do not have literacy skills in Arabic. So how they're gonna learn the language? And I think it would be really interesting to get insights from people on how language plays that role in their decision making to return home.
Okay, thank you very much, Mohammed. So there aren't any more questions yet in the question and answer box, but yeah, we'll give people a few more minutes in case anyone is busy typing a long question that's taking a while to submit. In the meantime, I have a question for Carla. Yeah, it was really interesting what you were saying about how the 1951 Refugee Convention definition of refugee is the one that is kind of widely accepted because it's been adopted by the UN as being the definition of what a refugee is. But you mentioned a couple of other definitions there, and I was just wondering whether either of those other definitions, in your from your point of view, are more fit for purpose when it comes to tackling the issue of how to define a climate refugee.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And it's a really interesting way to kind of think about sort of this terminology and the whether or not the terminology of climate refugee is ever possibly fit for its purpose. So yeah, the two definitions that I kind of briefly mentioned come from sort of the African continent context and then the sort of Latin American context. So both of those definitions are broader than the 1951 definition because they both include something to the effect of a refugee can include people that can't return to their countries of origin because of things that have sort of disturbed public order, something to that effect. It's not exactly that language, but that's in essence what it's describing. And they the definition in the African Unity definition also has a lot of context around the ensuring the ability for self-determination as well, which is a really interesting kind of part of that definition, which we don't really see in the 1951 definition either, which is it's not necessarily relevant here, but it's just an interesting bit of context I think that's maybe missing. But yeah, so that idea of things being kind of disturbing public order or being is obviously wider than this much more prescribed for definition of persecution for reasons of say race, religion, nationality, which obviously can't fit that climate or environmental harm context. Lots of academics have already looked at whether or not these particular definitions, which are obviously wider, might be able to fit the sort of climate refugee experience within them. And there is some suggestion that because of the way that it's described, it is possible. However, it's not really been seen in practice. And obviously this is, excuse me, this is something that, it is difficult, because if we're not seeing it happening in practice, then is it actually going to be possible? Because what we really need, I would suggest what we really need is something that is going to identify the specific climate harms that are happening to enable people to actually describe the harms that they're experiencing. This is maybe getting into more of the intricacies of it that I haven't really explained in my talk today, but it's something that I'm looking at specifically in my research. But obviously there's the element of individualized harm that has to be explored under the refugee definition. No matter which definition we're looking at, harm has to be individualized. And when we're thinking about the climate context, that's very difficult to do, because climate change, environmental degradation, it has that community aspect to it. It has that generalized aspect to it. So again, can that fit a little bit more into things that are disturbing public order or disturbing those sort of general aspects of society? Yes, possibly. So again, could that fit into those broader definitions better? Yes, possibly. But have we seen it in practice? No, we haven't. So yeah, it's interesting to think of their potential uses, but we haven't really seen it yet. So I suppose maybe my answer is time will tell. I'm not really sure if that's where I'm going with that answer, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And I think this is perhaps where some of the more recent academic research is going, with saying that maybe we should be thinking about, is this definitional gap that we've been so focused on, is it appropriate to be so focused on it, particularly if we're looking at some of the historical context that's behind both the 1951 refugee definition, and also the context that's behind climate change itself, that perhaps is not getting the attention in academia that it ought to, is another thing to maybe think about as well. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Carla. Yeah, that was really that really kind of added clarity to that discussion, and just kind of thinking of the 1951 Refugee Convention really as a product of its time, coming out of the Second World War, the Holocaust, the kind of mass displacement that had kind of and that was the case across Europe and other countries at that time, and now it seems like we needed a wider definition. And it's really good that you kind of, I think you've probably raised the awareness of lots of people in the audience of the existence of those other definitions. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, we have another couple of questions that have come in. So one of them, it kind of follows on the theme of definitions. So in connection with this paradox, some students from refugee backgrounds may not want to be identified as being from refugee backgrounds. So as suggested by James, do you think we should utilise data and systems to identify students from refugee backgrounds? This is something I've been pondering, as we can see how this could definitely make a difference to the support we offer. So yeah, so I'll pass over to you, James.
suppose there's probably two aspects to that question. One, should we, and also, are we actually able to? I think the latter is probably interesting one to start with, because it can be very sort of complicated unless a student sort of self-identifies on a process. I think there is now a box you can identify as you're applying through UCAS, which is a fairly new innovation. Otherwise, the only other way that a student may be identified might be on the immigration status they enrol with. But of course, you might well have some people who have naturalised as British citizens but still come from a refugee background. So I think it's one of those ones where if a student has self-identified and would like to be part of a community, through things like the STAR networks and other aspects, then absolutely. If it's also if it ever becomes a more mandatory sort of data collection in result of the access and participation, then I guess, well, it will be. But I'd always like to leave it really in the hands of the student to make that choice. But also, I think we need to let students know that they can make that choice in a safe space. So if they want to let the institution know, that they know the institution will use that in a supportive and sort of developmental manner to help in whatever way is needed. But I guess I wouldn't ever want it to be a sort of a mandatory labelling. I don't think that would ever be useful. I hope that answers that.
Okay, thanks very much, James. And now we have a question for all three speakers. We have a thank you to all three speakers and a question for James about any initial insights that you may have gained from your interviews with refugee background students about effective pedagogical approaches. I'm interested in particular in research around empathy in education and compassionate pedagogy.
So yeah, that's quite a substantive question. So in terms of the conversations with students, it was quite interesting because they had come from, as I say, I think all of the students I spoke with had come from a different educational background, had undertaken some study, and there were definitely some transitionary issues in terms of expectations of the UK higher education system. There were sometimes perceptions of what that might have involved, which were quite different from the reality. And I think there were, actually from my broader work with international students, there were often students who had come from countries which had an education system which had been originally, probably imposed is the right word, by the British. But the British system had then moved on quite substantially. So they had expected perhaps a more commonality than they then found. The word that did come up in this research particularly was criticality. So lots of questions, and I think I had at least a couple of students who say, what is this criticality? What is critical? So I think there is definitely a approach where we kind of set the pedagogic expectations of our system more clearly to students. As for actual sort of pedagogic approaches themselves, the work of bell hooks I've always quite liked. Teaching to transgress, sort of derived from a critical perspective. I don't think that necessarily has to just be for refugee background students. I think that move away from the sort of didactic delivery to that constructivist, drawing on people's learning and experiences, giving people a voice, working within the sort of capability development and the UN SDGs, all of those can be drawn upon to have a much more holistic, and I'd say much more interesting sort of education experience. So, if we can allow people to bring their perspective and their voice into the classroom, I've always found it to be a much more rewarding experience than just me talking for several hours. So I think that would be where I would start. So yeah, the work of bell hooks is an approach I've quite liked, and I think it would probably align with the obviously the students didn't speak in terms of pedagogy necessarily, but they spoke in terms of things that would have supported them, and I think there was an alignment there.
Okay, thanks very much, James. So we have another question that's come in, and this one's also for you, James. Sorry, we're keeping you very busy now. Okay, this is quite a long question. I think there's a few different questions within it. Okay, I'll just read it out. So how can access to higher education be improved for individuals from a forced migration background, particularly for those who have completed a few terms of study abroad or hold foreign qualifications that are not fully recognised in the UK? Refugees often face barriers to receiving student finance, even when their previous qualifications are assessed as lower than expected, or when they need to pursue further study to requalify for their profession. How can the system better accommodate these complexities, ensuring that refugees and forced migrants receive the necessary financial support to continue their education and enter the job market? James, just to say, I don't expect you to kind of tackle that whole problem in like about 3 or 4 minutes, but anyway, you might have some initial kind of insights into it.
I suppose just a snapshot is if we can treat people as individuals, everyone has an individual circumstance and experience, and I talked a little bit about recognition of prior learning experience in that. So this is something which I found, I suppose, quite interesting, again, beyond refugee background students, but similar issues for mature students, for example, coming in where they may not have a particular level of maths or English, or they may not have a degree, but they will have a professional experience which a lot of other students won't have. And I've never felt as a sector we've been particularly good at utilising and encouraging that engagement with that experience and using it to also inform our teaching. So it is a extraordinarily complicated picture to go from arrival in the UK into accessing higher education. But I do think if we can expand the provision, I think if we can expand that sort of pipeway, particularly for those students who don't come in speaking fluent English, for those students who perhaps don't come in with independent financial means, those students who perhaps don't come in with the educational qualifications, whether they get evidence or not, that would be a starting point for that cohort. And for those who have got that additional qualifications, as I mentioned, I think because of the pressures on the workforce, because of the pressure on the system, often it has to be, there are compliance issues, there are regulations to be followed, but I do think if we can talk to the person, if we can explore their prior learning and their professional context in much more detail, and then enable within the system that discretion to say, okay, you might not have the certificate, but I can see from this piece of work you've produced, that conversation that we've had, that you're clearly experienced in this field, and therefore we can support you to access this programme. That would be a very useful start. It's probably a much bigger question, as I say, if we want to move from this sort of distributive nature of justice and resource allocation to consider the education more holistically, and that's probably a bit beyond today, but there is definitely something more systemic that could also be looked at in terms of how we support students and their capability to study.
Okay, thank you so much, James. Okay, so now we're...
Sorry, Alex, I have a very quick question for
sure.
Carla, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course.
I was just thinking to what extent, in terms of the definitions, that they are political decisions rather than only legal, especially, we have the president of the US who is almost a denier of climate change, and I don't, because if the UN included that aspect of climate refugees, then that means with their quota every year, they bring in refugees from either camps in, for example, neighboring countries or where the war is. That means also they need to bring refugees from areas where climate change impacted them.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you can't, I can't remember who it was I was reading recently, but they said, it's impossible to remove the politics from the law, particularly in the immigration context. And when we're thinking about the kind of developments of the climate refugee issue, obviously there's been lots of proposed sort of solutions as to how do we actually protect individuals who are displaced across borders, because obviously as it stands at the moment there is no valid route to protection. And there is obviously a great deal of politics behind all of these decisions. And actually, I suppose this is something that goes all the way back to the original decisions of the 1951 conventions. And we can see the politics in those original definitions as well. And this is something I was kind of touching on with, thinking about looking at it through that post-colonial lens, thinking about the Eurocentrism behind that. The 1951 definition has been developed with a great deal of exclusion from a number of states that were at the time fighting for their independence, who obviously are now, often the ones that are at the forefront of the climate emergency. And actually, so that post-colonial history is coming right through into the climate, the climate problem as we are now looking at it. So there's a huge amount of politics involved in this, and obviously, as you say, the political decisions sort of continue to impact this. We've seen the USA obviously recently withdraw from things like the Paris Agreement. So we're seeing a rollback not only of existing refugee. We're seeing a rollback, particularly in the West, of existing refugee rights, but we're now seeing a rollback, particularly in the West again, of existing environmental protections, and particularly I would suggest because of the economic implications of that. But again, those who bear the brunt are those who are the least contributing to the climate emergency, and those who have been most historically impacted because of the colonial past of it. So if we look at it from a climate justice perspective, there is a lot to be said for that. So yeah, there's a great deal of politics involved, and I think this is why it makes looking at this from that there are some that say we should move away from the terminological, is that a word, discussions, because they're not necessarily positive in terms of finding a step forward, and there is something in that. We should be looking at substantive policy developments. Which is something that I am doing in my research. What are the potential policy developments that we can create? But actually, I don't think we can do that without also looking at the terminology that does exist in the academic literature and in the wider, what that is being consumed from the wider general public as well, including by those who are sitting in those places of politics. So yeah, I would agree with you. There's a huge amount of politics involved. I think hopefully that answers the question.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, once again, thank you so much to all three of our speakers. And it's been fascinating, as usual, to hear people from different disciplines discuss their research, and also to see what some of the resonances might be in terms of the themes. As James mentioned, one of the resonances was language. So thinking about language, the use of language, definitions, that's something that came out strongly across all three presentations. And also the theme of identity kind of seemed to resonate throughout all three as well. Okay, so if we could just move to the next slide before we wrap up. So this is the final session of Breaking Barriers Refugee Week, but we do have another event in the pipeline in a couple of weeks' time. For anyone who is in or around Leicester, we have a session coming up at the Literary Leicester Festival called Voices from the Other Side of Hope, Writing as Activism. We're going to have 3 local poets, refugee background poets, coming to talk about their work, including the Palestinian poet and academic Hawla Badwan. So yeah, I hope to see some of you there if you're able to make it. And yeah, so just to wrap up, just to say thank you so much, everybody, for coming along, and we hope to see you again next year.
Thank you, Alex, and everyone here.
Thank you for having us. That's very good.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.